Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where it's about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Debris. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, this new case that finds its way to Brian and Finola is a very interesting one because it involves a lady named Mariel calling for Brian specifically, first and last name. But when Brian shows up, he's like, I've never met her. So it's like, but why does she know your name? And why is she calling your name specifically? Obviously, it seems like there's like some shimmer from like her being connected to a piece of debris, but it disappeared. And so Brian goes and talks to her. But the moment he starts talking to her, she starts reciting stuff from his life, like things that she shouldn't know. Like she just happens to know all this stuff about him. And then later on, it becomes clearer and clearer. She's actually reciting full-blown conversations that Brian had. In particular, it's some of the conversations blur all over the line because he says at one point in time, like one of the lines she said is like, he's like, yeah, that's the last thing my mom said to me before I got shipped out. I think maybe specifically Afghanistan, maybe it was like specifically that mission, or maybe it was just something like, because he had been on multiple tours by this point in time. But then like the scope of everything gets smaller and smaller because it, in particular, would start kind of diving into that past, the past that involved the picture of the woman named Asalah, and kind of understanding all of that. And obviously, I thought it was kind of an interesting element to kind of get that insight into Brian, because he talks about it a lot throughout the episode, where he initially signed up for this, like thinking like, okay, we can do good here. We can, but it's like, he says like, basically, we came here with the right reasons, but somewhere along the way, it kind of goes wrong. Because for him, he kind of gives up believing that anything, like them staying there, he's like, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to change anything for the better. But other people around him, like Asalah, as well as like one of the people on his team, it's like, nah, like, we can change the world. We can save it. Like, we just have to keep going. It's not like saying it's not going to be the easiest thing, but we just have to keep going. We have to try. We can't just give up. But Brian, on some level, had kind of given up because he had kind of lost hope in like things getting better, just seeing like, and he was even telling that guy, it's like, hey, we'll see whether you kind of feel like that after a couple of tours. And like, I think it's just a thing of like that hope inside of you gets chipped away at more and more, where it's just everything you've seen, like people, because even at one point in time, it's like, oh, who's that boy? It's like, oh yeah, some kid from nearby, his dad works on it. It's like, no, go check him out. And it's like, oh, Brian, what, you think he's a bomber or something? It's like, well, and Brian kind of talks like, once you've kind of seen what he's seen, so it's like he's probably sadly seen kids being used as like bombs like that, sacrifices like that, there's a paranoia in his head that like this could be a possibility again. But Asalah, like, came to Brian because for her, it's like, you actually helped me. And, like, obviously you guys are doing recon, but she's like, my grandfather's in this village, so please just make sure that he's okay. Like, for her, it's like, he's the most important thing to her. Because he was basically her hope. It's what, like, despite all the terrible stuff in the world, everything terrible going on, the war and everything, it's like, at least with her grandfather, she feels like she can be grounded, that she can have, like, she can hold on to that glimmer of hope, and he can give her that. And she's like, feels like if something were to happen to him, if she lost him, that glimmer of hope would be slipping away. I hadn't really touched on it yet, but what kind of really sparks this is that, like, obviously Mariel's repeating lines and stuff like that, and when Brian gets closer, she grabs him, and it kind of sinks, not just their minds, but everything, like their blood and heart rate, like every aspect of them is literally in sync, but it's too much for their systems, and now it's kind of basically killing Brian. So it's a situation that they're trying to find a way to, like, how do we separate them? And it brings up a really interesting conversation of Finola thinking she has an understanding of this. She thinks that basically Brian got copied back in episode 2. She's like, so what if the debris kept all the memories of Brian? Like, the moment it made a copy of him, everything that is him, his memories and everything, it latched onto that, and it's held it in basically some specific space, and that basically this space is where the debris, like all the debris is connected, it's all communicating. So maybe whatever it is, like whatever debris that Mariel touched ended up kind of transferring all that because some fraction of Brian is there. But it also leads to so many other questions, like why, why did it use this opportunity? Like, they've come across many different pieces of debris subsequently since episode 2. So why has no other piece of debris done this? Like, why hasn't it kind of reached out to Brian? Why now? Like, maybe now is kind of the time. Maybe with, like, everything going on with George and, you know, Influx trying to find this particular dangerous piece of debris. Maybe that's what this is all connecting to. Like, maybe, like, whether it's the aliens, like, maybe it's like a safety measure where it's like it chooses someone to kind of prevent, like, this particular powerful piece of debris, which is kind of like potentially a powerful weapon, from falling into the wrong hands, and it found someone that felt suitable. Maybe because looking through his memories, because there's a copy of him, it looked through it, it's like, okay, maybe it ran maybe all the debris connected, kind of ran all the simulations. Maybe his experience, you know, working with Finola, dealing with debris, like, if they're all connected, then maybe it latches on. I mean, to be fair, because I was wondering, like, maybe his experiences with solving cases put him at the top of the list, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's what kind of made the debris or whatever, like, whether there's, like, an alien or some consciousness to the debris that, like, is kind of, you know, connecting everything together. Because it's almost like a hive mind, like, space that, like, all that kind of amalgamates. Like, maybe whatever that is, maybe all of the, because, like, I was about to say, because, like, that's the only piece of debris Brian's kind of come in really direct contact with. But I mean, I make the argument, like, they've come in direct contact with a lot of pieces of debris. Hell, they literally dealt with a piece of debris that, well, the argument could be like, well, they kind of undid that, so, like, technically Brian and Finola never came in contact with that debris in this reality, just because everything was kind of reset and everything. So I don't know. But then even Maddox was kind of like, well, what about you? Like, you were connected, like, you came in contact with the piece of debris. She's like, yeah, there's like probably like all the stuff about me is somewhere, which also begs the question, that means there's some version of George out there, because they used a piece of debris to bring him back. So, but what I thought was interesting, though, because obviously in this episode we see Maddox checking out a piece of debris, and it's like, oh, we got to test it a little bit. Part of me is wondering, does he plan on using this to kind of help with Dario? Can it help with Dario? Because it's like, if these pieces of debris all kind of make a copy of someone, that maybe he's thinking, like, maybe, well, because we don't know the full state of, like, Dario's condition. It just seems like, but I don't know, maybe it's like certain, like I said, synapses or something, like certain aspects of his brain, like, don't, like, communicate to the rest of his body. So I don't know whether, like, because I was wondering whether Maddox was kind of wondering if he could use this to help Dario in some shape or form. I'm sure, like, all of these pieces are part of a much larger puzzle that could lead to Maddox helping his son. But obviously this is, like, Finola's running theory. But then you have an interesting thing where Maddox is like, when's the last time Brian had his injection? It's like, what, you think this is connected? And it's like, well, I don't know. Like, we've just been monitoring his blood, but for some markers. And it's like, we still don't know what that whole thing is about. Once again, because Garcia had brought it up, like, oh, you still getting the injection? And he's like, yeah. So I'm like, once again, is Garcia getting something of that nature as well? Like, it has to have something to do with, like, a run-in with a piece of debris that you're kind of worried about that. Like, I guess it's like, maybe, like, there was an explosion and there's fragments of debris in him that kind of, like, pop up every once in a while to create some, because it's like, yeah, they're looking for some markers in his blood. Like, what that necessarily means, which obviously just being on NBC makes me think of, like, oh, yeah, the marker that's in, like, the 828ers. Well, everyone, it manifests, but in particular with the 828ers, they have, like, a marker in their DNA. Like, it made me kind of think of that, so maybe it could be kind of a similar vein, but nevertheless, inside of Brian and, you know, Mario's head, as we're going through, you know, understanding what happened, Mario and not Mario, but Asalah and Brian hit it off, because for him it's a situation of she talks about, like, obviously, like, she doesn't see, like, she thinks there's, like, not a lot of difference between America and Afghanistan. It's like, there are good people are good people, bad bad people. But for Brian, you know, because, like, it's a conversation. She's like, basically, she talks about she wants to, you know, go to America and kind of, like, practice, you know, piano. And he introduced her to Elton John, and it's like, you know, she's like, oh, I'd like to learn this song. He's like, me too. She's like, well, the nearest piano is, like, a long ways away, and I can't really go there during the conflict. But when the conflict is over, he's like, yeah, when it's over. But she's like, you don't actually believe it will be over. He's like, it's complex, you know. It's like, there's just too many moving variables, plus the whole thing of, yeah, we came here with the best of intentions, but somewhere along the way it went wrong. And so, are we, at this point in time, are we actually helping? But for her, she believes that peace will come, you know. And, you know, that's why, like, what her grandfather kind of represented, that kind of, you know, holding on to something to kind of believe in. And it's like, she asked Brian like what his was, because Brian kind of no, she was saying like basically holding on to her grandfather, like having something or someone to hold on so tight to like put kind of almost like hedge all your bets into being kind of your essentially your anchor. I'm paraphrasing and I'm probably not doing as good of a job of explaining, but it was almost like something to kind of anchor you down, to kind of be your latching on to hope, which she's like, yeah, I get like wanting to believe in something wholeheartedly and having something to believe in. And she asked him about it later on, but he never actually gave her an answer. And part of me was like, was it Asalah or was it something else? Like, has she become that for him? Because she made him want to believe again, and she made him hopeful that we can do something. He's like, I want to do something for this family, which his buddy was like, yeah, but it's not just about one family. But I think for Brian, it's like considering everything he's been through everything he's seen, helping at least one family, this family, then that, because like Asalah is like, she was kind of that hope, and it's like he needed to help her, because if he could help her, then maybe it could kind of sprout that seed of hope inside of him that she had become for him, because Asalah had actually helped him out. It's like she did something super dangerous, but she ended up getting photos of all the Taliban people, because she was like, if I get these photos for you, I'll help out however I can, but it's like, you just got to promise me that you'll get my grandfather out. And at first, Brian didn't want to make those promises, but she's like, please promise me. And he was like, I won't, I'll do what I can, But she got the photos for him. What was also interesting, and I wonder, was he actually there at the time, was like, it seems like he was, obviously Brian didn't really know him at the time, but because obviously partway through it, because they're trying to bring Brian out of this by like resetting his brain, kind of like electroshock therapy to a certain extent, like by shocking his system or trying to disconnect him. And partway through it, like while it's kind of glitching like the Matrix on the inside, he ends up looking and seeing Maddox, and he calls him Maddox, and Maddox is like, how do you know my name? And it's like, and then it kind of resets to kind of play like the memory originally did. But it's like, the fact is Maddox was there and everything made you go like, it's just interesting. Because once again, it's trying to show him something. It's like, well, Maddox is still knee deep in your life, and obviously he's up to some stuff. So maybe this is the Bree's way of warning him. Maybe the reason why it chose him, because it's like him and Maddox are so connected in that regard. Maybe it has something to do with like what Maddox is trying to do for Dario, but maybe all the other shady stuff he has to do just to do that. Who knows in that regard. But when the time came for their operation to get these particular Taliban members, sadly, Brian, partway through it, he's like, no, I remember this. And he's telling everyone, ceasefire. He's like, stop. He's like, I remember this. I got to stop it. And we find out Asalah got killed, I believe, in the crossfire. And even I was like, why was she back in the village? Because later on, Brian brings her body to her grandfather, and I was like, but why was she back in the village? Like, she was going to get her grandfather, and Brian told her to wait in a specific area. I'm glad, not glad, that's the effed up way to say it, but like, this is the better way I thought that was going to turn out, because I thought it was going to be a sad thing where it's like, either like Asalah got manipulated and then kind of died. I figured whatever it is had to be directly connected to like Brian, why he would feel so responsible, because it turns out like he ends up explaining to Finola, like, she came to her grandfather told her about, like, she became knowledgeable about like there being an ambush, and to make sure Brian didn't think that she had betrayed him, she tried to get to the village and warn him, and ended up dying because of it. And it's like her like desperation to like make him go like, no, I'm not trying to, I didn't betray you, like, you're a friend, like, I wanted to help you, and she ended up dying because of it. So Brian feels the blame of, like, and he even talks about, he keeps her photo around not to remember her, but to never forget what it's like to invest yourself into something you can lose. So I don't know how to necessarily take that as like, not like, I think that kind of it entails like, I initially take it as like a don't like invest in something, because like a reminder of like, when you invest in something, like, you could lose, like, people, like, that's why, like, when Finola meets him in the beginning, it's kind of like, oh, he's very cut off, and it's like, but being around Finola kind of brought back that spark of humanity, which he hadn't had in a long time. But sadly, I think he's kind of finding himself in that situation again. I mean, at the very least, we know there's at least one version of Brian out there in the multiverse of realities and stuff like that that got to that point, who was able to, maybe that's kind of in this Brian's future, that eventually he's able to kind of move forward where he can invest in Finola. I mean, who's to say he hasn't already, because he's already changed a lot. What he's gone through, what he's been willing to go through for her and her father, I think speaks volumes of the fact is that, you know, what Asalah kind of represented for him, that hope, that good, he sees that in Finola as well, because, you know, I mean, maybe that's what it also is too for him, is like when he looks at Finola, he does see Asalah, you know. I think that just kind of be an interesting element to it. Sadly, you know, he won't get full answers because Mario died. Like, it was just too much for her, which part of my brain was super suspicious. Like, do we really think that's the case? But it seems like, at least from what we've been presented, it seems like that actually is the case. But essentially, Maddox is doubling his doses, and he was like, yeah, I'm doing this just to make sure. But Brian's like, I'm sure this had nothing to do with, like, the dosages and stuff like that, the injections. But it's also like, you know, Brian was on the verge of figuring things out, because he was like, I wish you hadn't pulled me out, or at least waited, because he was close, because Mario was reaching her hand out to him. He was about to take it, but it's like, who knows what that would have meant. That could have signified you guys being so in sync that when she would have died and you would have died. But, like, Maddox is just saying, like, you were just a little bit stronger than her, so her system gave out before yours could, but you were almost there to, you know, dying. So, who knows? Maybe we won't get, it's still unclear, like, why it specifically chose those memories to kind of really resonate and kind of, like, make Brian relive. Like, I think we'll find out, keep going forward in future episodes, we'll really get a clear sign and understanding of that, because it's like, there's probably something hidden there, which I feel like the Maddox thing might be like the wink and nod of like, wait, yeah, because I'm sure if he'll go back, he'll be like, wait, things were either things were different, or now with current knowledge and looking back kind of with a different perspective, he's able to pick up on something that maybe he couldn't pick up on. Then, you know, we'll have to wait and see. But I also thought it was pretty dope that, like, obviously it's like, you know, Finola obviously cares about him deeply, because she would freaked out, like, worried, you know, wanting to do whatever she could, which kind of showcases, like, you know, it's not just like the last two episodes wasn't just about saving, you know, the universe. That was one thing, because everything was about to collapse upon itself. But it was like, at least for Brian, it was about getting back to Finola. Sadly, Finola didn't know Brian that well, but kind of got to know him a little bit, at least knowing, like, he cared about her and everything. Oh, yes, I didn't, you know, but what I was about to say is, like, right, we learned a little bit more about how Maddox and Brian, like how Maddox saved Brian. Basically, Brian, after, like, you know, after Asalah's death, they went to, like, they found, like, other, like, members hidden in a cave. He got revenge, and basically, I don't know whether he did it himself or whether his entire team was with him. I wonder where the rest of that team is. Like, are they still a part of the military, or did they die at some point in time? Because that's where also another angle where I thought, like, Asalah was going to die plus his entire team, but it never necessarily went to that. When he went to Asalah's body, like, the rest of his team was gone, so I don't know, it's just like, because it was like the Matrix breaking, because they were trying to break through to him with the electroshocks, and it was kind of working at this point in time, because he was kind of borderline lucid dreaming, where he could kind of tell, like, oh, this isn't real, I can try and stop this, I have to stop this, because I know what's about to happen. But basically the group of insurgents he killed were a protected group. They were a group the CIA kind of, like, had a connection to, where it was like, these guys aren't to be touched. So Brian was going to be arrested and charged for war crimes if it wasn't for Maddox, which is interesting, because obviously we learned, like, I think that was last episode, we learned about, like, one of the versions of Brian didn't accept Maddox's help and kept down the path of a war criminal. So I'm assuming everything else was up to that point was the same as, like, what we learned in this episode, except for when Maddox extended his hand, he was like, no, and, you know, became a war criminal. So, because they were going to charge him with war crimes and everything. So, but it also shows you why he's so indebted to Maddox, because Maddox saved him at a time when he was at kind of a very low point, I think, you know. So a lot of interesting stuff. Before I even end this, like, there's also the ending I thought was interesting, where it's like, okay, like, the different metals to the east, west, north, and south, and then finally it's like the black wind. So I'm assuming, like, okay, the fact is like very specific ones. It's like, oh, like the white metal, the yellow metal, so on and so, the blue metal. So I'm like, so could it be like specific debris pieces? Because could that be what that represents? That there are these specific debris pieces that flew to different locations, like like maybe like certain parts of the ship kind of regulating certain aspects flew in certain directions. Part of me thinks also like the Black Wind. That's just me being the pessimist I am. I'm like, that sounds sinister. That sounds like death. I don't know whether that's supposed to be what that means. I'm also curious, like, is that supposed to signify, like, you know, is that something more modern, or is that supposed to be like an old tale passed down, and it's kind of very relevant to our current circumstances? Because maybe there, you know, obviously we know now, like, who's to say that these. I mean, they're saying that this is the aliens' kind of first quote-unquote visit, but who's to say, like, maybe that's not supposed to represent, maybe that's supposed to represent that maybe they visited in the past, and that story's been passed down and kind of made it like, oh, like these metals and the Black Wind, that maybe it's symbolism for this age-old tale that was kind of passed down. Or maybe it is more modern, just, I don't know, it was just the way it was kind of cut into the episode, too. It was like, huh, that's interesting. So, I don't know what to make of that either. A lot of questions. We got some answers this episode, but still a lot of other questions being asked as well. There's also George going on his own. Obviously, like, Finola probably has to kind of be like, all right, I can't worry about you too much. But it's like, well, you're supposed to stay off the grid and stuff like that, I'm sure, but not much she can do now. But he's on his way to Virginia to kind of be near a satellite, and obviously it's like waiting for the Ligari files, which Finola ends up getting those at the end of the episode from Ferris. So we'll see where all this ultimately ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.